Every face in that town looked away. Every face but one. Oregon in the spring of 1874 was a country of hard rain and harder judgments, and it was in the churned mud outside the Millbrook Church that Ivy Duncan learned, in front of the whole assembled town, exactly how quickly a promised future could dissolve into public humiliation. She had stood at that makeshift altar in her mother's own mended wedding dress, the same one 3 generations of Duncan women had worn before her, rain threatening in the gray afternoon sky, and the whole town crowded into the small church, and spilling out along its muddy front steps for want of proper seating, waiting for Thomas Reed to speak his vows, her hand already halfway extended for the ring she had watched him carry so carefully in his coat pocket the whole week before. She had watched instead, with a disbelief that took several long seconds to fully register, as Thomas turned from the preacher's book, muttered something about a mistake he could not rightly explain, and walked away from her down the muddy aisle without a single word of proper apology, leaving Ivy standing alone at the altar with the whole of Millbrook's assembled citizens watching her humiliation unfold in real time. The rain came down in earnest moments later, as though the sky itself had waited only for the cruelty to finish before adding its own indignity to the day. And Ivy Duncan stood in the churned mud in her ruined dress while the gathered townsfolk, uncertain how to manage so public a scene, began, one by one, to look away and drift toward their own wagons and horses, murmuring the particular uncomfortable sympathy of people who would rather not be seen witnessing a woman's worst moment too closely. Every face in that crowd looked away, every face but one. Ezra Colton, the town's deputy sheriff, a quiet man of 31 who had returned from the war 8 years before with a limp he never spoke of, and a reputation for fairness he had built one careful day at a time since, crossed the muddy churchyard while the rest of the town retreated, and stopped before Ivy Duncan with his hat already in his hand. He had learned something of standing alone in front of a watching crowd himself, though he rarely spoke of it. He had come home from the war with a wound that had cost him the easy stride he'd once had, and had walked into his first Millbrook church social afterward to a silence considerably colder than mere politeness, for the town had, in those early post-war years, been divided still on which side of the old conflict deserved its sympathy, and a young man with a Union limp had found himself, that first winter home, standing very much alone in a room full of people who would not quite meet his eye either. He had never forgotten what that particular loneliness felt like, nor how much a single act of plain decency might have eased it. Had anyone troubled to offer one, he had promised himself, somewhere in that cold first winter, that he would not let another soul stand alone in a crowd's silence if he could help it, whatever it cost him to step forward. "Miss Duncan," Ezra said, plain and steady, "I don't have much to offer you standing here, but I've got what's in my pocket, and I've got my name, and I find both are yours if you want them." He pressed into her cold, shaking hand the whole of what he carried that day, a single silver dollar, the last coin to his name until his next month's wages came due, and said, simply, "Ezra Colton, I've served this town 6 years, and I've never once seen a soul treated the way you were just treated in front of God and all of Millbrook, and I find I'm not willing to let you stand here alone in the mud, pretending the rest of us didn't see it happen." Ivy Duncan looked up at him through the rain, her whole composed dignity hanging by the thinnest possible thread, and found, in the plain steadiness of his offered hand and his offered name, the first genuine kindness the whole terrible afternoon had shown her. "I don't need charity, Mr. Colton," Ivy said, though her voice shook badly enough to undercut the pride behind the words. "This ain't charity, ma'am," Ezra said. Charity's what a man gives to feel better about himself. I'm offering you $1 and an escort out of this mud because it's the plain decent thing to do, and I find I'd rather do the plain decent thing than watch you stand here a moment longer being stared at by folks too polite to help and too curious to leave. He held out his arm, careful and formal despite the rain soaking them both. May I see you home, Miss Duncan? She took his arm. The whole watching town, the narrator will tell you, remembered that moment for years afterward, not the jilting itself, which time and gossip eventually softened into an old, half-forgotten scandal, but the sight of the town's quiet deputy walking a ruined bride home through the rain with the same careful courtesy he might have shown a duchess, his own coat draped over her shoulders against the worst of the weather, refusing, by his every deliberate action, to let her humiliation stand as the whole of the day's story. More than one of the very citizens who had looked away that afternoon would recall, in later years, feeling the particular sting of shame at their own retreat only once they saw plainly, in Ezra's example, exactly what a braver response might have looked like. The weeks immediately following the wedding proved harder than the day itself. In some ways, for a public humiliation does not end with the humiliating moment but lingers. Instead, in every careful, pitying glance a small-town citizen's cannot quite help giving the woman at its center. Ivy kept to her family's ranch as much as she reasonably could that first fortnight, her mother fussing over her with a worried tenderness that only underscored, however lovingly meant, exactly how thoroughly the town had already begun treating her as a fragile thing rather than a person who had simply survived a cruelty. It took Ivy several difficult weeks to learn the truth of why Thomas Reed had abandoned her so publicly, and the truth, when it finally emerged, proved considerably uglier than simple cold feet. Her family's modest ranch bordered the considerably larger Vance spread to the north, and old Cornelius Vance had coveted the Duncan family's water rights along Miller Creek for the better part of a decade, the creek running through Duncan land before it ever reached his own drier, less fortunate acreage. Ivy's father, a stubborn and proud man, had refused every offer Vance made for the land across 10 years of patient, escalating pressure, and Cornelius Vance, having exhausted every honest avenue of persuasion, had turned at last to something considerably less honest. He had approached Thomas Reed privately some weeks before the wedding and offered the young man a considerable sum, enough to start his own modest spread free and clear, in exchange for publicly abandoning Ivy at the altar, calculating, correctly as it happened, that the humiliation and scandal attached to such a public jilting would shame the proud Duncan family badly enough to finally force a sale of the disputed water rights at whatever price Vance cared to offer. Ezra found Thomas Reed at the livery stable where the young man had taken work since abandoning his own small claim, and confronted him plainly, with Ivy standing at his side, having insisted on hearing the truth herself rather than receive it second-hand. Thomas would not meet either of their eyes at first, his hands busy with a bridle he did not need mending, the whole shape of him gone smaller and more wretched than the confident young man who had once courted Ivy with easy charm. "I did not think it through, Miss Duncan," he said finally, low. "Vance came to me quiet, one evening in March, and laid the whole sum out on my own kitchen table, more money than I'd have seen in 5 years working an honest claim, and told me it was only business, that your family's pride would bend faster than your father's stubbornness ever would, once the whole town had seen the shame of it done publicly. I told myself I was doing you a kindness even, sparing you a hard marriage to a man too poor to properly keep you." He looked up at last, his face raw with a shame that had plainly cost him sleep. "I knew, standing at that altar, the moment I saw your face, that I was about to do something I'd never rightly undo. I did it anyway. I took the money because I was a coward and a fool both, and I have regretted it every single day since, though I understand that regret buys you nothing back, Miss Duncan, and I don't expect you to forgive it." "I do not forgive it, Thomas," Ivy said, steady, though her voice carried more sorrow than fury by then. "I do not know that I ever will. But I find I would rather have the truth of it plainly than spend the rest of my life wondering what I did wrong to deserve that mud. Will you swear the whole of it before witnesses, and let the truth settle where it ought to settle, on Vance's own doorstep rather than mine?" "I will," Thomas said. "It is the least I owe you, and I know it is not nearly enough." Before Millbrook's spring planting had fully settled into summer, the whole shape of Cornelius Vance's scheme lay exposed, and Ezra Colton, who had spent 6 years enforcing the town's law with a fairness that made him few enemies and fewer favors, found himself for the first time squarely opposed to the most powerful rancher in the county. If a story of a public humiliation finally, thoroughly answered is the kind that keeps you listening, stay. What Ezra and Ivy built together in the weeks that followed changed the whole shape of Millbrook's understanding of who truly held power in that town. Ezra called on Ivy regularly through that difficult spring. At first, simply to see that her family managed the fresh gossip and strain without additional hardship. And later, as the weeks wore on, for reasons that had considerably less to do with duty, and considerably more to do with the particular ease he found in her company. She managed her own family's modest accounts with a sharp, capable mind her father had never fully trusted a daughter to possess, and Ezra, watching her work through the ranch's difficult finances one quiet evening, found himself genuinely admiring a competence society had trained him to expect only from a son. "You keep these books better than half the merchants in town," Ezra observed, looking over her careful figures. "My father never wanted a daughter clever enough to notice when a deal favored someone else more than it favored us," Ivy said, with a dry humor that had begun, over the weeks, to resurface from beneath the careful composure the jilting had first buried it under. "He got one anyway. I find it has proven useful more often than he cares to admit. What will you do once the dust of this whole business settles?" Ezra asked. "I do not imagine a woman with your head for figures means to spend her whole life simply waiting on the next man fool enough to court her properly." "I have thought of opening my own small business, in time," Ivy admitted, somewhat shy of the confession. "A dry goods store, perhaps, or a bookkeeping service for the smaller ranches that cannot afford a proper accountant of their own. I do not know that Millbrook is ready for a woman managing her own trade outright, but I find I have grown considerably less concerned, since the wedding, with what Millbrook believes ready or not." "I'd wager on you managing it fine, whatever the town believes," Ezra said, and meant it plainly enough that Ivy found herself, for the first time in weeks, laughing outright at the easy confidence of it. Their conversations over those careful weeks ranged further than accounts and ambitions both, Ezra telling her, in time, of his own family back east, a father who had never forgiven him for surviving a war 2 elder brothers had not, and Ivy learning, in the telling, exactly why a man so capable of plain kindness had spent 8 years keeping himself so carefully solitary in a town that had never fully welcomed him either. "I understand something of being made to feel you don't quite belong somewhere you've every right to be, Ezra," Ivy said, one such evening. "I find that understanding rather binds 2 people together faster than most polite courtships manage." "I've found the same," Ezra admitted. Quiet, there came an evening, some weeks into that careful deepening friendship, when Ezra walked Ivy home from a church social neither of them had much wanted to attend, both still wary of the town's lingering curious glances, and found himself, at her own gate, reluctant to say good night. "I keep that $1 you gave me, Ezra," Ivy admitted, low, in the blue evening light. "I have not spent it, though I have had cause enough to need it. I find I cannot quite bring myself to let it go. I'd rather you kept it than spent it, if I'm honest," Ezra said, and reached, careful, to tuck a strand of wind-loosed hair back from her face, his hand lingering a moment longer than the small gesture strictly required. Neither of them moved to widen the distance between them, the whole quiet evening holding its breath around the narrow space that remained. "Ezra," Ivy said, unsteady, "I do not know that I am ready to trust anything so soon after. You don't have to be ready tonight," Ezra said, low, stepping back himself, though it cost him visibly. "I've got patience enough for both of us, same as I had $1 enough for both of us that day in the mud. I'll wait as long as the waiting takes." It was Cornelius Vance's own mounting frustration, as the town's sympathy shifted steadily away from him and toward the jilted bride and her steady deputy, that produced the sharpest danger of that whole difficult season. Having failed to force the Duncan family's hand through simple humiliation, and watching with growing alarm as Ezra Colton's own quiet investigation into Thomas Reed's bribery threatened to expose the whole scheme publicly, Vance turned to the one lever still available to him: his own considerable influence over the town council that employed Millbrook's sheriff and deputy both. He petitioned the council directly, arguing that Deputy Colton's personal involvement with Miss Duncan represented an improper conflict of interest given his ongoing investigation into matters touching the Duncan family's own land dispute, and pressed, with careful, wounded reasonableness, for Ezra's immediate suspension pending review. It was a calculated, dangerous move, aimed precisely at removing the one man capable of properly exposing Vance's bribery before the council could act on it, and it very nearly succeeded, for a town council that depended heavily on Vance's own considerable tax contribution to the county coffers found itself reluctant to challenge his petition too directly. The council chairman, a cautious merchant named Mr. Pruitt, who owed Vance a considerable outstanding debt of his own, argued for immediate suspension pending review, his own conflict of interest as unremarked upon by the assembled council as Vance clearly hoped Ezra's would be. The chamber that evening was packed tighter than Ezra had ever seen it, word of the council's business having traveled through Millbrook with the particular speed such confrontations always found, and more than one face in that crowd, Ezra noted, belonged to citizens who had once looked away in the churchyard mud and now leaned forward, plainly eager to see how the reckoning would settle. Vance himself sat in the front row of that packed chamber, composed and confident, plainly certain that his own considerable influence would carry the vote regardless of whatever evidence a mere deputy might produce against it. He had not troubled to attend such council matters personally in years, a fact Ezra noted as its own quiet measure of exactly how threatened the man felt by the coming reckoning. Ezra stood before that council himself, plain and unbowed, and answered the challenge with the same steady honesty that had governed every day of his 6 years' service. "I have not once let my regard for Miss Duncan influence the particulars of my investigation, gentlemen," Ezra said. "I have Thomas Reed's own signed statement, taken before 2 witnesses neither Mr. Vance nor I selected, confirming the bribe paid to abandon Miss Duncan at her own wedding for the express purpose of forcing her family's water rights sale. That statement stands on its own evidence, whatever my personal feelings toward the woman it happens to vindicate. If this council wishes to suspend me for the crime of caring about the town I've sworn to protect, I'll accept that suspension. But I'd ask you to weigh, first, whether protecting Mr. Vance's comfort is truly worth burying evidence of a genuine crime committed against one of your own citizens. It was Ivy herself, present in the council chamber at her own insistence, who delivered the final, decisive testimony. "I do not ask this council's pity, gentlemen," Ivy said, standing before them with the same composed dignity that had carried her through the whole terrible ordeal. "I ask only that you weigh Thomas Reed's sworn statement honestly, and consider whether a man's considerable wealth ought to purchase him immunity from a scheme that humiliated me in front of this entire town for the sake of my father's water rights. I stood in the mud outside that church, while every one of you looked away. I am asking, now, that you not look away from the truth as easily as you once looked away from my shame." Cornelius Vance rose to answer, his composure still largely intact, and attempted to dismiss the whole proceeding as a young deputy's sentimental overreach exploited by a jilted woman eager for sympathy. "I have done nothing this council can properly fault, gentlemen," Vance said, smooth and dismissive. "Whatever arrangement Mr. Reed chose to make of his own free will regarding his own wedding plans is hardly a matter for this chamber's concern, and I resent the implication that a private business transaction between two consenting men constitutes some manner of crime against a woman I have never once wronged directly. You wronged her the moment you paid a man to humiliate her in front of the whole town in order to squeeze her father's water rights out from under him, Miss Vance," Ezra said, before the council could weigh Vance's careful deflection too seriously. "And I have Mr. Reed's own sworn statement, taken before witnesses of this council's own choosing rather than mine, confirming every particular of it. I would ask this council plainly, is a wealthy man's comfort truly worth more, in Millbrook's own accounting, than a citizen's right not to be publicly ruined for another man's profit?" The chamber went very quiet at that, and Mr. Pruitt, the council chairman whose own debt to Vance had shaped his earlier eagerness for Ezra's suspension, found himself, under the weight of the gathered crowd's watchful attention, unable to press the matter further without appearing to protect Vance's interests over the town's own plain sense of justice. The council, faced with sworn testimony and a growing public sympathy Vance's own scheme had inadvertently created, declined to suspend Ezra Colton, and instead opened a formal inquiry into Cornelius Vance's own conduct, an inquiry that concluded, by that summer's end, in a formal censure and a court-ordered settlement requiring Vance to pay the Duncan family considerable damages for the orchestrated humiliation, a settlement that, in the particular irony Ivy herself noted with some satisfaction, proved considerably more valuable than the water rights Vance had originally hoped to seize. It was that same summer, with the whole difficult season's reckoning finally settled, that Ezra found Ivy once more at her family's own gate, the silver dollar he had once given her now worn smooth from months of careful keeping in her own pocket. "I gave you $1 and a name in the mud outside that church, Ivy," Ezra said, taking her hand, the summer evening warm around them where the spring rain had once been cold. "I find I would like to offer you something considerably more permanent now, if you'll have it. Not out of pity, and not to settle any score with Vance or Reed, either one, because I have spent this whole difficult season watching you meet every indignity with more grace and more nerve than most folks manage in a lifetime, and I find I would like to spend the rest of mine standing beside you rather than simply walking you home." He turned the worn silver dollar over once in her palm before closing her fingers gently around it again. "Keep the dollar. Keep the name, too, properly this time, if you'll have both." The kiss she gave him then, at the same gate where his patients had first asked nothing of her but time, was quiet and certain, and what broke open in Ivy was the plain astonishment of being chosen, at last, not to erase her worst day, but because someone had simply refused to let that day be the whole of her story. Cornelius Vance's own standing in the county never fully recovered from the council's formal censure. For a rancher's power in a small territory rests as much on his neighbor's good opinion as on his acreage, and Millbrook's citizens, once the truth of the bribery scheme was fully known, found themselves considerably less willing to extend him the easy deference his wealth had once purchased, without question. He paid the court-ordered settlement in full, grudging and furious, and retreated to his own considerable holdings, his ambitions toward the Duncan family's water rights permanently abandoned. Thomas Reed, having sworn his testimony honestly before the council despite the shame it cost him, left Millbrook within the year for a fresh start in a territory where his own name did not carry quite so heavy a story attached to it, and Ivy, for her part, found she bore him less lasting anger than she once believed she would, understanding, with time, that a poor man's fear and a wealthy man's greed had combined to produce a cruelty neither alone might have managed. Ivy did, in time, open the small bookkeeping business she had once only dreamed of, managing the accounts of half a dozen smaller ranches across the county with the same sharp, careful competence her father had once undervalued in a daughter. And Millbrook, whatever its earlier reservations about a woman managing her own trade, came to rely on her services with a trust that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with her own proven worth. They were married that autumn at the same Millbrook church, with the whole town turned out to witness a wedding considerably more genuinely celebrated than the one that had ended so badly there before, and more than one guest remarked, quietly, that the same muddy churchyard now looked, in the golden autumn light, like an entirely different place than the one they remembered from that rainy spring afternoon. Ivy kept the silver dollar all her life after, mounted in a small frame beside their own wedding portrait, a plain reminder of the exact moment a quiet deputy, with nothing to his name, had offered her everything he had anyway, and the town of Millbrook, for years afterward, told the story of the jilted bride and the deputy's dollar as the truest measure of character the county had ever witnessed. Not the cruelty of a public humiliation, but the plain, unhesitating kindness of the one man who refused to look away. Their own children, raised on the story from the time they could properly understand it, grew up believing, as their mother had come to believe that rainy afternoon, that a person's true worth was measured a great deal more honestly by who stepped forward in a crowd's silence than by who stood safely among the ones who simply looked away. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where love arrived not through grand rescue, but through the plain refusal to let cruelty go unanswered, then this story was for you. Out on the rain-soaked hills of Oregon, where the wind keeps the only memory of what was, the love between Ezra Colton and the woman left standing in the mud became the kind that does not need anyone to remember it to be real. Every face in that town looked away. His never did, not once, for the whole of the rest of their lives together. If stories of frontier love that endured through hardship, cruelty, and the kind of quiet courage only the West seems to demand speak to something in you, follow the lonesome trail for more. Here, the love stories are quiet, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail.